Hello, and thank you for joining us as we speak with a very thoughtful filmmaker, Avijit Mukul Kishore. In an oeuvre spanning across 25 years, Mukul has explored themes of home, autobiography, and memory, and their inseparable link with political history. In our conversation today, Islands of Hope, Mukul will share with us multiple forms of engagement with the history of a young nation through the characters in his films, who tend to reference, either directly or obliquely, but always paradoxically, the hopes and violence inherent in the making of India, whether partition, the nation building period of the 1950s and 60s, or Kashmir. As we approach Constitution Day on November 26th and Black Day, the day of the Babri Masjid demolition on December 6th, both constant reminders of the need to safeguard our constitutional rights, Mukul will take us through itineraries of the Indian modern, from the making of the citizen and its connections with imaginations of urban design to an exploration of intimate domesticity as a site of revealing both the trauma of partition and the contemporary alienation of the 21st century metropolis. Ever present as a specter is his preoccupation with the contradictions between lives lived and histories narrated, and the evasive quality of exilic memory that is in perpetual separation from and yearning for home and belonging. Emblematic of this distance between personal memory and political history is perhaps Aga Shahid Ali's lines: "Your history gets in the way of my memory," a crucial inspiration for visual artist Nilima Sheikh's engagement with love, loss, and beauty in Kashmir, the subject of one of several of the films Mukul will speak with us about today. If the questions of rights and citizenship Mughal explores through his work have taken on renewed and urgent significance in the context of the promise of smart cities and accompanying slum demolitions, the Citizenship Amendment Act 2019 and the abrogation of Article 370, Mukul's keen attention to form and the role of image making and cinema in the process of culture formation remains exemplary of the dialectic between form and content. Through a playful and provocative mix of formats, from 16 film and digital videos in both color and black and white, to archival footage from state propaganda films and mainstream cinema, along with alternative voices in documentary and experimental video, Mukul creates a parallax view that offers new ways of seeing, making unfamiliar worlds we assume familiarity with. This attempt is at the core of what we aim to do at ASAP, and through our discussion today, we hope to disturb what is taken for granted, to question what is rendered as tradition, and to pull the strings of memory to ask how this might confound and interrupt the violence of history and create space for the everyday practice of hope. While our speaker today needs no introduction, for the benefit of those in our audiences, Avijit Mukul Kishore is a Mumbai-based filmmaker, curator, and writer. He studied cinematography at the Film and Television Institute of India and history at Delhi University. His collaborative works in documentary and interdisciplinary moving image practices have been showcased at Documenta 14, Chicago Architecture Biennial, Kochi Muziris Biennale, and film festivals like CPH Docs, Sheffield Docfest, and IDFA. His films include, among many others, Lovely Villa, Architecture as Autobiography with Rohan Shivkumar in 2019, The Garden of Forgotten Snow in 2018, Nostalgia for the Future, co-directed by Rohan Shivkumar in 2017, and Snapshots from a Family Album in 2004. He has also collaborated on visual arts projects such as In Search of Vanished Blood with Nalini Malani in 2012 and Turning with Vivan Sundaram in 2008. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few housekeeping notes for our audience members. We encourage an interactive session, so please do share questions and comments in the Q&A box, which should be located at the bottom panel of your screen. We will open up the discussion to the audience after Mugul's talk. We'll also post some relevant links and references in the chat box during the discussion, so please do keep an eye out for those. Mukul, immense gratitude to you for being with us here today. Without further ado, over to you.
Thanks so much, Radhika, for the introduction. And I'd like to thank ASAPART for inviting me to make this talk today on my practice and everything that Radhika has already laid out so well, by way of introduction. And I'm going to be sharing five different film clips and talk about the thoughts, the ideas, the process behind them. Some of them longer than the rest, and all made over about a 20-year period, and opening up many questions, many thoughts, many provocations, and reflections, about our lives, about domesticity, about homes, belonging, identity, citizenship, the country, and of course, art and film. You know, I'll start my presentation now.
घर, ये वो मशीन है जिसमें हम जीते हैं। वो लिबास जिसे पहनकर अपने शरीर और अपने परिवार को सुरक्षित रखते हैं। यहीं हम अपनी अभिलाषाओं और आकांक्षाओं को भी सहेज कर रखते हैं, सपने देखते हैं। हम ये उम्मीद करते हैं कि हम अपने ही बनाए सपनों के काबिल निकलेंगे, हमारे शरीर अपने घरों को ओढ़ने के लायक होंगे। कुछ घर हम खुद बनाते हैं, कुछ हमारे लिए बनाए जाते हैं। सपने हम खुद सजोते हैं या फिर हमारे लिए सजोए जाते हैं। आधुनिकता की कल्पना नागरिकों के एकजुट होकर एक ही समय काल में अपने इतिहास और भूगोल की भिन्नता मिटाकर सांस से सांस मिलाकर काम करने में है। विविधता और समानता की धुंधली रेखाएं पहचानने में है।
The architecture of the home for the modern Indian citizen who inhabits a certain idea of a body of the citizen and individual. And we do this by looking at five different architectural sites built pretty much over 100-year period. The film is available. We'll be sharing a link with you. So those of you who are interested, you can watch the film in its entirety when you have the time. And what I want to talk about here is that this is produced by this organization, uh, which recently shut down or merged with another larger government organization called, well, this was Films Division India, which made documentary and propaganda films for the country. It's a subject that I've researched quite a lot in terms of researching visual history, the entire government archive of recording the history of our nation, and in the process, constructing us in a particular mold. So, if the government is making a film about us, it has to have an idea of who we are, who this citizen is, and it molds us by making a certain film for us. Pretty much like we make homes for different individuals, like architects make homes, build cities for different individuals. So you imagine who this person is going to be, what his or her body is like, and therefore you build a home keeping these things in mind. It's an invented individual, both as a citizen or as a consumer or a viewer of these films. It's a very invaluable archive, of course, much discredited as being propagandist, but that was its brief. And when you look at it as an archive, it's a great resource that many of us have engaged with. And for a certain period, their experiments in film form were unprecedented and have pretty much been not, been equaled or paralleled of late. Other things have happened, but what they've done is very, very unique. So there we are, title screens of many of their films. And if you read them, this is who we are trying to construct as an individual, as a society, as a nation. And these are the homes, that we're making. And you can see that there's a certain idea of this individual, of a citizen in this entire post-independence nation building period that we're talking about. You're talking about affordable housing, you're talking about building society, you're talking about building community. And the medium for doing this, apart from everything else, is the medium of film, you know. So there are these ideas that appear as metonyms through the film: home, body, city, and the nation, which almost end up getting used interchangeably, in our history and in the course of these films. And the material that we use in this film, of ours, borrows from the state archive and other archives, national archives and so on, and of course on our collective memory, public memory, not only visual but also oral, from broadcasting, from music, from things that even if you have not experienced it, even if you were not part of it, you know that it belongs to a particular period, it belongs to a particular era, a particular ethos. If you're familiar with the history, you know what that moment in history might have stood for. So we've shot this film on multiple formats, 16 millimeter film, not because it's supposedly superior to digital video, but because it carries within it a timestamp of something that might have been made earlier and not in the present day, color and black and white, because they have very, very different registers of experience and association. All of these are frame grabs from nostalgia for the future. And digital video looks completely different, even though we're looking at Chandigarh, the capital complex. So the film is moving through these multiple experiences and through these multiple registers to evoke this sense of memory, evoke this sense of history, in us. And black and white and color again, So if I were to cycle through these again, the film is moving through all this, and some examples from the popular Hindi cinemas and the archetypes of the modern Indian man, and it's always man, not person or woman in this period, by three archetypal heroes played by Devanand, Raj Kapoor, and Dilip Kumar. I won't get too much into it now. And, everything that these three ideas of modernity then stood for. So these are these multiple materials, that we are using to talk about this idea of citizen, body, home, city, nation, and using these multiple experiences and registers. And I'm going to go from here to my first film, which took about 6 to 7 years to make. It was shot over a 5-year period. Snapshots from a family album, completed in 2004. And it's a film where I'm looking at my parents, I'm looking at myself, I'm looking at my brother, I'm looking at our two generations, in our family. My parents working out of two different cities, the metropolises of Delhi and Bombay because of their professions. And my brother and I recently having completed our professional education, moving towards our careers. And it's looking at all of us at different levels, coming of age, coming into our own, and so on. My parents moving towards retirement, and in the background is the turn of the century, India shining. Um, it is a period of great political churning and turmoil. And the film does not directly go into it, but it's all happening in the background when you look at the period in which the film is made. And the language of the film is one of intimacy, one of togetherness, of family, of ritual, of festival, celebration, and of course, a lot of travel between these two cities and the idea of this homeland that we have, almost an imaginary homeland, as Amitabh Ghosh would call it, at Allahabad in UP, where both my parents come from. But all of these major issues are only obliquely referred to. They're all there, present in the background. But everything is through banter, through exchange, through jokes, almost through flirtation, and a lot of references to cinema, music, and art. And my mother, who's a literature person here, asking me, "Are you making a silent film, Mukul? Because I have turned off the fan for the purposes of sound recording." And goes on to say, "It looks like you're making a money call film, where she'll only speak at the very end." So there is this self-reflexive exchange happening throughout, while looking at family, while looking at the mundane, but the very, very palpable sense of the present and the moment in that everyday domestic and mundane, which then opens out. Another documentary might have foregrounded that context. This film takes it to the end of the film, where you start discussing the present, the moment, histories, and politics, you know, and jokes like, okay, so what has my film become? It's become an art film, you know, and back and forth. Don't you like art films? So this is, the first set of slides is from the beginning of the film. This is from the end of the film, which punctuates. It's forever, if there is nothing like the fourth wall in this film. It's always this, and the filmmaker, the camera, everybody is always present here. And this is the clip that I have chosen, which comes pretty much 40 minutes into the film, if not later, where I finally sit my parents down. And here I'm talking to my mother about the partition, which happened when she was 5 years old, and what it really meant for a little child growing up in Paharganj in Delhi in the midst of all that turmoil and violence, and how she took to it. So I'm going to play this.
और 47 का मुझे याद है, आई वॉज पुट 5 years old. तो हम लोग ऐसे ही सड़क पे खड़े हुए थे, मैं और पापा. मैं वहाँ पे, अब तो शक्ल सारी को तुमने देखी है, वो सड़क, उस मोहल्ले की शक्ल बदल गई है. एक छोटी सी ऐसी मुंडेर सी दीवार हुआ करती थी वहाँ पे. मैं उसके ऊपर बैठी हुई थी और पापा नीचे मुझे पकड़ के खड़े हुए थे. अचानक हल्ला मचा, कर्फ्यू लग गया, घर चलो घर चलो. अब अपने को समझ में तो आता नहीं था कि कर्फ्यू होता क्या है. यूँ लगता था जैसे कुंडी लगाते हैं या कुछ ऐसे करते हैं, तो वो कर्फ्यू लगना कुछ उस तरीके की बात होगी. लेकिन रातों रात हमारी गली के बाहर एक लोहे का दरवाज़ा लगाया गया. सब लोगों की ड्यूटी लगती थी रात रात, पुरुषों की. और मैं अपने सिरहाने सब्ज़ी काटने वाली छुरी लेके सोती थी, चाकू लेके सोती थी, कि मैंने टू बी पॉलिटिकली करेक्ट कि मुसलमान लोग आएंगे तो मैं उनको इस छुरी से मारूंगी. फिर उसके बाद हम लोग जब बड़े होने लगे, वो जैसे आदमी जहाँ रहता है वहाँ के रहन सहन का इतना असर पड़ता है. तो उन तमाम वो रिफ्यूजी लड़कियों के बीच में हम लोगों को भी, अब वो ग्रोइंग अप 10 years 11 years, तो बड़ी बड़ी लड़कियों को देख के परांदा लगाने का बड़ा शौक चढ़ता। परांदा उस किसको बोलते जानते हो? परांदे को चुटीला। काला ही चुटीला, लाल पीला नहीं लगाते थे, और उसमें बाल बनाने में ऊपर से छोटे नहीं बनाते थे, हल्का सा थोड़ा सा बाल छोड़ के नीचे से होकर के परांदा करके इतनी लंबी लंबी वो ऐसे ही झुला झुला के वो करते थे। और उसके अलावा क्या कि एक छाल होती है किसी पेड़ की, उसे दंदासा बोलते हैं। दंदासे से दांत साफ करने से वो होता कि दांत चमक तो ज़रूर जाते थे लेकिन लाल लाल से हो जाते थे। तो हम लोगों में ये होड़ लगी रहती थी कि किसका ये नीचे वाले होंठ को पंजाबी में बुल बोलते हैं, किसका बुल कितना ज़्यादा लाल हुआ है। तो सब छोटी छोटी बच्चियाँ हम लोग यूँ कर कर के, देख मेरा बुल ज़्यादा लाल है, देख मेरा बुल ज़्यादा लाल है।
You can see that you're talking about a 5-year-old child, and there's a sense of embarrassment with which she mentions the violence that is drilled into her without her awareness, without her understanding. And that is a bit that I sat on for quite a while. I couldn't decide whether to include it in the film or not because it's not something that I feel comfortable about. But uh, she herself is looking pretty embarrassed about saying that this is how it was done. But at the same time, you're talking about growing up with these girls who, and children who had come from across the border, and how you are playing. You're playing with everybody, and these girls' games and so on. So the entire film, really the entire film is made up of moments that are conversational, but what might otherwise be this pertinent detail is something that comes out in conversation once in a while and is curated to be presented as such in that manner. And yeah, so personal history, memory that we are talking about. And if I move on from here to the next film, which is The Garden of Forgotten Snow from 2018, which is looking at the work of visual artist Nilima Sheikh, painter, who's had a major engagement with Kashmir, you know, which spans pretty much, I think, over 6 decades now. And her work on Kashmir, where she talks about making it into a project where she wants to break this entire binary of Kashmir as a place of luxury and beauty or of strife and separatism and violence, by bringing out multiple other narratives that the place has historically in literature, in art history, and so on. So this is a clip, and of course, because she's using all these literary references of writings of poetry on Kashmir over a very long period of time, multiple centuries. She is using those at the backs of her panels. These are long vertical scrolls as installations, which she paints on the front and puts text at the back of. And this is a film that I made with her in 2018. She's somebody whose work I've known very well and documented over a long period of time. So,
my first set of paintings on Kashmir were done in 2002, I think, soon after the Gujarat riots. And, I had a plan to work on Kashmir and I had many ideas of what I wanted to do. And then the riots happened. Suddenly everything seemed to be impermanent around, and my sense of locale was questioned, and so it all seemed too ambitious to do and too difficult to do. So at that time I had been reading a lot of Aka Shahid Ali. And in a way this became like a route through which I could begin to talk about Kashmir.
"Don't tell my father I have died," he says. And I follow him through blood on the road, and hundreds of shoes the mourners left behind as they ran from the funeral, victims of the firing. From windows we hear grieving mothers, and the snow begins to fall on us like ash, black, on edges of flames. It cannot extinguish the neighborhoods, the homes set ablaze by neighborhood soldiers.
And if you look at this, even the characters that she's painting, the stories that she's painting here are from historical or are historical references made over the centuries, or literary references which she is painting in her work. Who better to talk about political history, personal history, memory than Aga Shahid Ali, whom she quotes a lot. And this film also uses, a poem that she uses, and the film uses it in turn here as part of its commentary. And of course, that word, home, you know. And talking of homes, I moved to my city, the city that I currently live in, Mumbai. So, snapshots split over two cities. Uh, we went to Kashmir, and now if I look at Mumbai here, this entire video is part of a work in progress called the Concrete Lift. I started shooting my surroundings, around the place where I live in North Mumbai, in the suburbs in Borivali. And all of this used to be an industrial area, which not suddenly, which over a period of time started coming down because of the prices of real estate, and the industries moved out. And residential and commercial construction started coming up, completely transforming the view from my house and this entire landscape and the city in turn. And what I've shot over many, many years, this entire process, and the view, if you can see outside, was not there earlier. This is where the factory was, so there was nothing this high earlier. I'm on the 11th floor, and there was nothing outside here. There was a factory which was lower. And so this is a work that is a long work. It's been shown twice in two different art contexts, once at Khoj and once at another place. And there was a 50-minute version and a half-hour version. What I've done here is I've made a very, very compressed version just to give you a sense of what this landscape was and what it's becoming, and it's continuing to change, you know. And uh, in this entire landscape, what's important for me is the body of the laborer. And most of the time, it's a young adult who's a migrant. And just by their clothes and maybe body language, I can tell that they're from the eastern part of India, maybe Bihar or Bengal. And there's a certain sense of work, there's a certain sense of this tiny human body against the scale of this entire city, and the sense of theatricality, if you look at this entire process. So I'm going to play this short excerpt. Whose home and whose city are we talking about? Um, so I don't know how clear this was on the small screen. Maybe many of you are watching this on your mobile screens, and it's dark. It's meant for large screen projection and held over a long period of time, where for very often nothing is happening, but then something happens, and there's a certain sense of scale that plays out when you can see those boys are wheeling their barrows, you know and there's a light on the ground which is projecting their giant shadows on the building outside and within, you know So this entire play of the human scale that plays out on this place here is something that was fascinating. And there are many, many questions that open out about labor laws, about safety regulations that are not followed. This happens in rain when, they're not using enough rain protection or safety gear, and building the city that we are going to inhabit, and they're going to move on somewhere, this house that I'm living in, the houses that you see outside, yeah, so it's something that I continue to shoot, and the buildings outside is where during the lockdown you could see that the laborers who were stuck here because they couldn't go home were the ones who were lighting lamps and who were ringing bells because the prime minister had asked them to do that. And there is all that material which is in an archive that I can access at any point of time and make a video of maybe different kinds. And I'm going to end with the last film that we made, Lovely Villa Architecture as Autobiography, which is about the place where Rohan Shiv Kumar, my collaborator partner, who is an architect and urban studies person and academic, where he grew up. It's a place where in the 1960s and early 70s, the government used architecture, especially the architecture of a public housing project, as an experiment in social engineering, where it's LIC colony belonging to the Life Insurance Corporation, which is a public sector company, which came up with this public housing designed by Charles Correa, where the whole brief was that if you owned an insurance policy of a certain kind, at the end of the term of your insurance policy, you could get a house instead of money, or you could already move in, and as you pay your premiums, you could own the house over a period of time. So there were no filters. It was designed as a place where on every floor there'll be different configurations of houses, from a single room apartment to maybe a 3 or 4 bedroom apartment, forcing people of different economic groups, migrants, families, joint families, professionals, working people to live together and interact. The architecture was such that it facilitated hanging out, interacting, community building, the exact opposite of how we are building uh, housing now, which is gated, which is filtered by faith, by your dietary preference, by community, and so on, which are things that people seem to value much more. As this idea of the state forcing people to live together and then build community is something that which is very, 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 very admirable and respectable, and this still exists. So this complex designed by Charles Correa, and this is the building where Rohan's mother still lives. And if you look at the nameplates, if you look at the surnames, and we can identify community, we can identify the region somebody comes from by looking at their names. And unfortunately, this is also something that people use to profile you when they need to, So there's a Sikh person there, there's a Marathi person, maybe a Telugu speaking person, two Tamilian families, one mixed family, and a Goan, Silvera, and these are only the first 2 floors. There are 2 more, So again, it's about growing up in this house. It's about growing up in this entire ethos, which shapes you. I mean, you grow up in this and you believe this is how the world is meant to be. This is how the world is. And that's very, 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 very admirable. It's a very successful project in that regard, And this comes in the middle of the film where Rohan talks about a shift that happens, 1984 when Mrs. Gandhi is killed, and 92 and 93 when there are Bombay riots. So the only other memory of the time was a Sikh family that came to live with our neighbors for a few days, refugees that found safety in the relatively secular nature of the state-built housing colony, you know. And this is also perhaps the reason my friends Zubair and Amjad found it to be their only shelter when their neighborhoods burned in the Hindu-Muslim riots of 92 and 93. Yeah, so the film talks about all of this, and it's a film that um, is it spends the first half. It spends the first half laying this entire ethos out, and the second half turns startlingly personal to the point of being private, where he discusses the death of his father, who passed away in 2014, 10 years ago. And that is the excerpt that I'm going to show you. I'm not going to show you the more overtly and directly political bits, but the one where he talks about his father. This is an edited excerpt from that.
Being here, we can know we are, with the sun overhead and the ground beneath our feet. Being here, his breath upon my shoulder and the cold air conditioner. I remember him, his spectacles distorting the ceiling fan. This won't be the first time I have said this, and it won't be the last. Destabilizing dizzy currents in the half-light of the computer screen, changing. I watch him rise again and again in a trance, in the summer like weather. Being here again and again, endlessly, rewind, rewind, rewind. Memories of the throbbing drum machine, a last cuff, a shrug. Anything else that we could have done?
Have fun.
Goodbye. On the edge of this memory lies an island of hope. Oceans rise and fall. The grass sways as we make like stars on the screen of the night sky. Constellations mirror our limbs. We dance, our bodies positioned still, but freer than ever. Martyr, mother, my child, my only child, my father, my son. How precisely I remember
How
him.
precisely I remember him. Not his face, his voice sometimes, but more his order. An easy warmth, a quick joke, a jealous love, a twinkle, and a tear. Have fun. Goodbye.
And this is a film that, in many ways, is about the literary and philosophical concept of the death of the father. In this case, at one level, literally, of the passing away of Rohan's father, uh, a major presence in that house. And at another level, the passing away of Charles Correa and an entire ethos of city building, nation building, home building that he was part of. And at a third level, a certain idea of community and a certain idea of India that Rohan talks about. But on the edge of this memory lies an island of hope. And, that is the hope that we all live by. And this is, where I'd like to conclude this presentation. And we all can start a conversation here. I do have another clip, but I think this is where I'd like to stop and start with the discussion, if that's okay.
Thank you, Mukul. Each of the films you shared with us today approaches really the contingency of belonging. And I think what's particularly striking is the memory is not merely ephemeral, but almost forms the bedrock of a collective imagination on which the nation or the identity of the nation stands. And I wonder if to remember is, in one sense, who we were and who we might even choose to become. The floor is now open for discussion, and please do write in your questions and comments in the Q&A box. While we give our audiences a few moments to gather their thoughts, I thought maybe I'll start off with a few queries really of my own. I think since a while, what's always very fascinating is that there's a very personal quality to your filmmaking and almost sets a sort of poses a set of dilemmas for the viewer, because in its autobiographical mode, it almost feels as if there's an interrogation of the family and its relation with the self, that one is forced to really confront an othering of the self as well, and questions one's situatedness within the political. And I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit about the motivations for this mode of practice as you began, and also in terms of like what were the responses and challenges of the family in terms of consent and your own editorial decision making as you decided to film and then actually curate.
Yeah. No, thanks a lot for that question, Radhika. And it's interesting that, I think because I was talking about my own family, those questions of consent were very, very important, you know. It's also, yeah, of course, about the first film, Snapshots from a Family Album, you know. The thing also is that, when you are shooting your own family, it becomes easier to push the boundaries, of going a little extra. And if you see the film, there are moments where they're protesting, that I'm shooting too much, that I'm always, in their face. As long as it's banter, as long as it's a joke, I might include it in the film. But if somebody is really upset, I switch off the camera. And Snapshots is as much about what it doesn't say as what it does, because there are areas that are private that are not just for, it's not just my prerogative to talk about them if it's about my personal life, but it's also about them and their consent and their comfort, because it is a public act of making a film. Of course, I could have chosen to violate that consent, but it was important for me not to. It was really important for me not to. And I was asked these questions earlier, as to, yeah, why would you not do that? And I'm like, yeah, later, maybe in a different film. But at this point of time, there are things that the film will not go into. There are things that the film will not record. If you take, like a lot of my documentary filmmaker friends would ask things like, this is uh, uh, an autoethnographic film, which it is. So why aren't you shooting the death of your grandmother? Why aren't you recording, certain moments that, and like the, shifting from Delhi to Bombay and so on. And I was very clear that there are things that my parents wouldn't want to, and I myself would not want to make permanent. There are things that you're meant to forget. This is of course long before Instagram and long before the perpetual recording of our lives and sharing of our lives, that oversharing that we make now. you know so those things will not go into it. If it's a question of my identity, my sexual orientation, my beliefs or anything, if you look at it enough, it's all there in the subtext. If you don't, the film still works. If you don't get it, the film still works at another level. And yeah, so it becomes important. It really becomes important, which is why I find it very, very hard to make films where, let's say, where people present themselves or people come across as negative characters, which is the trope in so much of documentary or fiction filmmaking or storytelling. You know, there are good people and there are bad people, there are evil people, there are people who are oppressing others and so on. And documentary also follows that kind of storytelling, vertical divide between the people who are suffering and the people who are the cause of that suffering. I find it very hard to do that. I'm also a cinematographer, so it's a relationship that I'm always a part of. And it's a question that comes up in our gaze and nostalgia for the future, where you say that, okay, if you are the government making a film for citizens and molding them in a particular way, your entire look is one of, we care for you and we want to make the scheme work for you and so on. If you are an independent filmmaker, an activist filmmaker, your entire look might be that, look, we care for you, but the government is also a problem. So we want to talk about that as well. Both are well meaning, or at least imagine that they're well meaning, but it's always a downward gaze. It's the gaze of a savior, it's the gaze of, somebody who knows better than the audience and maybe even the subject. And that's something that makes me very uncomfortable. So if people are presenting themselves in a certain manner, then I have a hard time dealing with that material. If it's somebody else's film, then I go home as the cameraman who shot it and moved on, and so on. The relationship in Lovely Villa is different, you know because that's scripted and co-directed by Rohan, and he didn't have any problems sharing private things. So the only argument I think that we had about it was the shot of his father on the hospital bed, which I didn't want to include for this reason. But he was very clear that it didn't bother him and it was important for him to have that as part of the narrative, you know. So, yeah, it's a film that really takes you by surprise. And just depending on, just looking at how private some of it is, and the filmmaker is willing to share that. Yeah.
Yes, there's something also about the death of the father there, as you said, which is personal and, in so many ways, in a psychoanalytical frame, it becomes a lot more than that. But it's also very interesting how you portray architecture as sort of imagined to encapsulate all these different kinds of bodies coalescing into one another. But uh, there seems to be a attempt to flesh out the friction in what is supposed to be a perfect overlap by the state. And I think in each of these films, sometimes we find that there are these recurring forms of failure, of perhaps control in the making of an ideal citizenry, which are evident in these forms of memory. And I was wondering if you could say something more about the gap between individual and collective memory today, and uh, when we seem to be in a new kind of juncture of nation making, or I don't know, unmaking, and if some of the more recent films might be a sort of response to these shifts.
Yeah. Mm. So, yes, I mean, if I were to look at the title of Nostalgia for the Future, it's an oxymoron. It doesn't mean anything, right? How can you have a nostalgia for the future? It's a queering of temporality, it's a queering of time, you know. And for us, it becomes, there's a way in which we were imagined, as part of a collective, as part of citizenry post independence. And that entire project of nation building, which, comes across in multiple ways, and especially, the way you see it, it happens through this housing project in Bombay, in LIC Colony, and many others, you know. So it's a certain, like, much of it is really, really respectable, and we, as the people who inhabit that future that was then imagined, it is a nostalgia that we have for the way in which we were imagined, therefore, nostalgia for the future, you know. Yes, of course, there are failures along the way. There are failures along the way, there are slippages along the way, and not, let's say, all of it is not successful. And then there are historical turns along the way, as we all know, you know. Um, but it's that imagination which is very different. I mean, nostalgia, without saying it, is a film about the present time, is really a film about the present time, and just how differently we are looking at ourselves and how we're looking at society, as you very rightly put in your question, where we are not looking at inclusivity. We're really not looking at it at inclusivity unless it serves us in some way, maybe electorally, but in a very, very fragmented kind of manner. And it shows, like I said, through the way we're building houses, which are meant to be designed to be exclusive. And yeah, the way we are, the kind of aggressive, violent moment that we seem to be inhabiting at present. So, but I think that, if there'll be a lot of work which is pessimistic, which is quite, which reflects the kind of anguish that there exists, and especially, when we're doom scrolling on social media, that the kind of anxiety, that we have, that the world embodies, carries these days. It's something that it's really something that, many other films and other forms of media will even instrumentalize, especially if you look at the news media, you know, what a beast it is, really, what a beast it is, what a violent beast it is. And I find it very important to, I find a lot of inspiration from the work of, let's say, somebody like Nelima Sheikh, you know, who, if you're talking about home and if you're talking about identity and displacement, the entire period when she, along with Ghulam Sheikh, had to leave Baroda in the middle of the riots in 2002 and move to Delhi for several months. and then engaging with Kashmir with all its problems, through other people's work. I think it becomes important. It really becomes important to reflect on all those, and yeah, and do what one can, through our practice as artists, filmmakers, or teachers. Really, yeah. Mm.
I think there are a couple of questions from the audience, and maybe I can just read them out. We can maybe take both of them together or take one by one. I'll read out Lisa Das's first. Your documentaries often explore the intersection of personal narratives and larger socio-political landscapes, such as in Nostalgia for the Future and Electric Shadows. How do you navigate the balance between an artist's subjectivity and the documentary's obligation to truth, especially when addressing historical and social themes? Maybe you can take this.
Sure. And yeah, I think the second one is similar. Paris Borua's question. Yeah. Mm.
I can read Paras
Mhm.
Barua's question is your work often explores the intersections of urban landscapes, personal narratives, and cultural memory. How do you approach the challenge of visually representing such layered themes? And what techniques do you employ to ensure the nuances of these stories resonate with audiences across different contexts?
So, to take the first question first, I just feel that, in many ways, I guess, a lot of the work that I have done has had a tone, has really had a tone of familiarity and engagement with the person that you're shooting with, you know, whether it's my family or whether it's a film on a certain visual artist or, people who. So it's a question of building those relationships before you can, or you maybe already have those relationships, and before you start filming, um, and a certain way in which you conduct those conversations, which are not putting people in a corner, which are more fluid and open, where um, like things get said in a certain way where I know the importance for it to be direct when it needs to be, you know. But otherwise, that entire balance between artistic subjectivity and documentary's obligation to truth. Um, I really feel that, truth is something that is always subjective anyway, is really always subjective, and what becomes important for me is to be honest to my own subjectivity and acknowledge my own subjectivity while looking at a subject, including things that that may be beyond my comprehension. And if that is so, then, acknowledge that in the film, and so historical and social themes as well, really, I mean, it's um, really all of us, there's this entire talk of one term that floated around, in the media some years ago, was that this video is doctored, you know, this video is doctored, which is circulating in the news or social media or something. And all of us acknowledge that doctoring videos is what we do, really, that is, we construct things to make them look a certain way. And are we honest about it, or are we malicious about it? What is our intent? That becomes important, because the films are made to look, the films are contrived, the films are honestly deliberately constructed either to look spontaneous and smoothly flowing, or jagged and disjointed. And the truth is somewhere in between those layers of form and text, that the film is then dealing with. Um, Again, if it was really a question of reporting something directly, then maybe film is not the best medium for that, you know, because it's a temporal medium. It exists in time. It works with different registers, how it looks matters, how you photograph matters, how you frame matters. There's subjectivity in all of that. And even in the bits that you saw in Lovely Villa, or even earlier in Nostalgia, there are these different textures. It might have looked like it's cracking up, on the internet, but a lot of it is old cell phone video, which again carries a register of memory, which has an element of truth. So if Rohan's father is performing a certain way for the camera, but now when I look at it 20 years later, or as many years as it has been, it tells me that this is something that happened and it happened that long ago. And we're looking at a person who's no longer with us. So truth gets constructed, truth really gets constructed, and which truth do I want to construct becomes then important to look at. And the intersections of urban landscapes, personal narratives, and cultural memory approach the challenge of visually representing such layered themes, and nuance of stories resonate with audience across different contexts. Yeah, I mean, that is always the effort and the struggle it takes. It takes work to do that. It really takes work to do that. And um, it's really important to understand what is beyond the idea level, and beyond the textual level, what is going to experientially work. you know so at the theoretical level we can do a lot of things, at the text level we can do a lot of things, but what do you do at the experiential level? Because the film, like I said, is going to exist in time and viewed in time, from point A to point B, hopefully. And and really, honestly, by way of practice, sometimes it just takes a lot of trial and error. By experience, you also know what works or what may not work, but even with all the experience, most of the time you just have to do it to figure out if it's working or not. And yeah, that's what.
Mukul, there's an anonymous question. If you could please speak about the reception of your work and where the films are being seen, and if the audiences that you envision are also being reached. There's a way of you to know that.
Sorry, what is the question?
If the audiences that you envision for the films that you have made, if they are being reached, and what the reception of the films is.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that the audiences are being reached. Now, if the question is that whether films actually make a difference, then I honestly don't know, and I honestly don't think so, because it's not something that's going to bring about any direct action or change. But then it's something that starts conversations. You're talking to people, you're trying to make people aware, you're trying to understand something yourself. And by reaching out to people, whether it's anybody, it's students, it is policymakers, it is anybody, a general audience, and then you have to make a film in a particular way that they would engage with it, and yeah, not feel patronized, not feel condescended to. And but then again, there are all kinds of films and really all kinds of audiences. There are times when we do want to feel like we're the perpetrator, and you feel that, oh, I felt guilty, so therefore I felt good about this. But no, I mean, I don't think that is serves a purpose, beyond a point. So you do, I mean, of course you make films for them to be seen, and pretty much all my films, save maybe one or two, are online for open viewing. Yeah, it's another matter that people may not get to them, and that's always a struggle. That is always a struggle. And they get screened. I mean, they get screened in the academic circuits, in the festival circuits, in the documentary circuits, which unfortunately, as we all know, have really shrunk in the last 7 or 8 years. Have really shrunk. So it's not that easy to screen things as it used to be earlier. But yeah, I mean, one still does it. One really still does it. Okay.
I guess we're running out of time, but just a last sort of question based on what you just said about conversation. I think a lot of your work has been also quite exceptionally collaborative work, and based and really arising from long-standing friendships, whether it is with, say, Nilima Sheikh or also with Nalini Malani and other visual artists. And I was wondering if you could perhaps say something about the role of friendship in also doing collaborative and collective work, and that also seems increasingly a lot more important today. And how do you see that process?
Yeah. Um, no, like I said, that I've been privileged to, have worked with all these visual artists, whether it's Nalini Malani, Nilima Sheikh, Vivan Sundaram, many others. And either on their installation work, or as somebody who's documenting it, or as somebody who's made films on art history, you know and it immediately brings out a different there is that trust is very important, when you're filming with them. And it shows, it really shows in the work, in the conversation, in their comfort levels, and what they choose to share, really what they choose to share. Because it is, everyone, all of us are concerned about questions of representation. And, you then know that what filters you need to wear, or what filters you can actually drop while sharing something. And it's again, an important process, because each of these artists, their work is very, very different, and many of their works are very different from each other, even if it belongs to the same artist. So to be able to film that, and to be able to interpret that in this two-dimensional medium of photography and film, uh, temporal photography, video, or film, is something that needs a lot of engagement, and it needs thought, where it's an act of translation. It's really an act of translation, where you are translating the work which exists in one medium, into film, which is a different medium. So the way you'd shoot a painting is very different from the way you'd shoot an immersive three-dimensional, installation, from the way you'll shoot maybe a performance art piece. And yeah, so it becomes important to be able to maybe keep the essence of the original, but also make it a work that stands as a film. Which, if it's documentation, then it's of a different nature. But if it's something that needs to exist as a film, then it needs to stand on its own. And yeah, so therefore those collaborations are really special, and crucial. Are really crucial to be able to do that. So yeah, and yeah, so I really feel, that engagement and that discussion and the collaboration, and of course, a question of trust then becomes very important. So to be able to work together.
Thank you. I think also with translation, it's also creating an own work in itself, right? And that's
Absolutely.
what's very fascinating about the process, and also in intermediate spaces. But we've unfortunately run out of time, and I really want to say thank you so much for a very evocative conversation. And it does really feel like there's a search for what you call islands of hope, and which I think all of us are very much seeking in this moment. I also want to say thank you to our audiences for being with us today. The conversation will be uploaded within a week on the app and on the website. Please do also keep a lookout for our upcoming coverage over the next few weeks of the Dharamshala International Film Festival, as well as the Serendipity Arts Festival. Thank you so much, and good
Thanks a
evening.
lot for the session, to everyone who's present, Radhika, and everybody at ASAP Art. Thank you.